The last 500 years of Fontaine has been somewhat of a roller coaster for the people of Fontaine itself, but its leaders have had a much worse time. From the very first Hydro Archon Egeria to the imposter Furina, each of them has suffered in their own ways. But who among them has had the toughest time? And is anyone truly at fault for all this suffering? In this video, we're going to talk about what each of them did and examine the lives and legacies they were left with to determine just who among these three had the toughest time. Before we dive into this, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Let's start with the person with whom all of this began, the first Hydro Archon Egeria. There is quite a bit of lore that talks about Egeria and how she relates to the Primordial Sea, but I won't cover the details here. All you need to know is that Egeria had the ability to wield and manipulate the Primordial Sea, a substance that has existed since Tevat's earliest days. She was known by many names, one of which the Queen of the Seas, which presumably came from this ability of hers to control the Primordial Sea. The Oceanids were also created by Egeria, and after doing so, she tasked them to find a way to connect and understand the many different species that existed in Tevat. This was done to supposedly find a way to better connect the different living beings spread out across Tevat. As a result of this mission, the Oceanids eventually developed a longing to live on land alongside the many creatures they had interacted with. Wanting to fulfill the request of her creation, she used the Primordial Sea to grant their wish. She essentially infused the Oceanids with the life-giving properties of the Primordial Sea, turning them into humans. They weren't actually humans, but rather Oceanids given humanoid forms. This act was what kicked off all the problems that Fontaine would face for the next 500 years or so. You see, Celestia wasn't very pleased with the fact that an Archon had just created humans, something gods were apparently forbidden to do, though we don't really know why. As such, Celestia delivered their divine judgment and proclaimed that sometime in the future, Fontaine would be engulfed by the sea, dissolving all these so-called humans and turning them back to their original forms and leaving the Hydro Archon alone. Now, once you hear the stories about Furina and Focalors later in this video, you might wonder what suffering the first Hydro Archon even went through. She wasn't around to see any of this happen anyway, right? Well, after being given this prophecy, the Hydro Archon pleaded and begged with Celestia to save what was essentially her children, but Celestia just wouldn't budge. Egeria would spend most of her time after this trying to find a solution to this problem, but when the cataclysm happened, she had to put things on hold and handed over this task to Focalors. It's my belief that Egeria expected to return from the battle in Tunigi Hollow, but fate is rather cruel and she instead met her demise there. This is where I think her suffering was at its most potent. Egeria likely spent hundreds of years looking for a solution to save her people, but ultimately never found one, and she died not knowing whether her people would ever be saved. Yes, she did leave Focalors behind as her successor to find a solution, but it's likely she died never knowing the outcome. It was probably a rather regret-filled death, given she died not being able to save the people she cared so much for. Her death and legacy, however, caused the next Hydro Archon to be chained to an even worse fate. Focalors had unfortunately inherited the sin Egeria was branded with, and the monumental task of figuring out how to go against the heavens themselves. The price here was astronomical. If she failed, every Fontainian would cease to exist, and the region itself would be drowned in a great flood. Fortunately, Focalors was a crafty lady. As you know in the main story, Focalors saved Fontaine by essentially tricking Celestia into thinking she was still acting as the Archon, while in secret, she created a system to extract and store Indemnitium, an energy source. Using this energy source, she was able to forcibly destroy the throne of Hydro and return the authority of Hydro back to its rightful owner, the Hydro sovereign Novalet. It was still pretty much a gamble at this point, as her plan relied on the sovereign using its authority to convert the Oceanids Egeria had created into true humans and thus circumventing the prophecy. While it had a fundamentally happy ending, consider what Focalors' life actually was. From the very beginning, she had to live her life knowing she would die. Any small mistake, any secret being revealed, even at the very last moment, and all of it would have been for nothing. I don't know how difficult it might be knowing that the purpose of your life was to eventually die, and if you failed, you would still die anyway, but bring all of Fontaine along with you. It's a monumental burden to shoulder. I personally think it was pretty unfair for Egeria to have handed over this responsibility to Focalors, though she still managed to carry out her duty anyways. We saw Focalors for all of 10 minutes before the guillotine fell upon her, and it's rather unfortunate that for 500 years, she was essentially trapped in the Oratrice with only death to look forward to. A life that seemed pretty crappy if you ask me. But Focalors didn't go about this alone, however. In order to trick the highest authority in all of Tevat, she had to place a distraction in plain sight. Someone to play the role of the Hydro Archon as she labored and worked in the background. This distraction came in the form of Furina, an Oceanic turned human. Furina's job was simple, but far from easy. She had to put up a facade of being the Hydro Archon to the people of Fontaine, Tevat, and most importantly, Celestia. Without her, all of Focalor's plans wouldn't have worked, or perhaps would have been discovered much sooner. Furina did this for 500 years, give or take. Now you could argue that all Furina had to do was just pretend to be the Archon. All the while, she would live in a big palace, had adoring fans, and had practically most of her desires, whether it be food or entertainment, given to her. But it's important to remember that she is still fundamentally just a human, albeit given an artificially extended life through a curse. Throughout her tasks, she has had to see generations of friends die, live with a constant fear of being found out, and mentally tough it through all the things that were happening. If she were a god, who are used to having longer lives, I'd easily say this isn't as tough of a task. But a human having to endure this would be very mentally taxing. I mean, it came to a point where she had basically lost her control over her own emotions and didn't even know when to cry. By the end though, Furina was just mentally broken, and who knows how long it would take for a normal human to heal all this damage. Now, I foresee different camps forming in the comments by this point, given the title of the video. But let me be clear, they all suffered. There isn't a single one of them who had an easy life. Egeria died without knowing what would happen to her own people, Focalors was stuck with a task that ensured her death, and Furina was mentally tortured for 5 centuries. If I were to choose, I'd probably say Focalors and Furina had it way worse, with Focalors probably inching out ahead of Furina. I say this because both Egeria and Furina, at the very least, had some semblance of a normal life, but Focalors was from day one forced to bear this burden, and her release came at the cost of her own life. A price she was more than happy to pay, but doesn't detract from her rather single-tone existence. You could argue that for Focalors, it wasn't as bad, as this duty was all she had known, but again, it's just my opinion. What I'm sure we can all agree on is that all of this was brought on by Celestia and their rules. There better be some really strong reason for the taboo against creating humans, otherwise, it seems they purposely created a pretty nasty situation for all involved just for going against them. Again, let me remind you, this is all just opinions and there's no right or wrong here. Let me know in the comments who you think suffered the most among these 3. If you enjoyed watching the video, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day ahead.